Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The dust motes danced in the late afternoon light filtering through the attic's single window, each speck a tiny performer in the stale air that hadn't been disturbed in months. I'd been putting off this task since Mom passed. Sorting through her belongings felt like archaeology, each box a layer of sediment from a life I thought I knew completely. The house creaked around me, settling into evening with the familiar groans of old wood and loose joints. That's when I found it, wrapped in a yellowed bedsheet behind a stack of Christmas decorations that hadn't seen daylight since the Clinton administration. The mirror was heavier than I expected, its ornate bronze frame tarnished to an almost black patina. Victorian, maybe earlier. The glass itself seemed oddly pristine despite its age, reflecting my sweaty face with unsettling clarity. A folded piece of paper had been tucked behind the frame, held in place by a thin wire. My mother's handwriting, though shakier than I remembered. Look only last. The sequence must be exact. Living room on, kitchen off, bedroom on, bathroom off, hallway on, only when the reflection descends. I turned the paper over, searching for more explanation, but found only a date from 3 years ago, shortly before Mom had started showing signs of the confusion that would eventually consume her final months. The mirror had probably been banished to the attic during one of her episodes, as Dad had diplomatically called them. Standing there in the dim attic, I felt the weight of the mirror in my hands and the weight of the house around me. Since inheriting the place 6 months ago, I'd been living here alone, trying to decide whether to sell or stay. The isolation was getting to me. I'd catch myself talking to empty rooms, leaving lights on in spaces I wasn't using just to feel less alone. The hallway downstairs seemed like the perfect spot for the mirror. The narrow corridor had always felt cramped and dark, and a good-sized mirror would help open it up, create an illusion of space. I maneuvered it down the steep attic stairs with considerable effort, grateful for the wall-mounted hooks that were already in place. Mom had hung a landscape painting there years ago. The mirror settled into position with satisfying precision, like it had been meant for that exact spot. I stepped back to admire the improvement and froze. The reflection wasn't quite right. In the mirror, I could see down the hallway toward the living room, just as I should. But in the reflected living room, the lamp beside Mom's old armchair was on, a warm golden glow that cast familiar shadows across the reflected walls. I turned to look directly into the living room behind me. The lamp was off. I was certain of it. I'd made a habit of keeping lights off during the day to save on electricity, and I distinctly remembered switching everything off after breakfast. I walked into the living room and flicked the switch. The lamp came on, bathing the room in the same warm light I'd seen in the mirror. But when I returned to the hallway and looked at the reflection again, the mirrored living room was dark. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the light off again. In the mirror, it came back on. This had to be some kind of optical illusion. Old mirrors sometimes had imperfections in the silvering that could create strange effects. I'd read about that somewhere. The angle of the afternoon light combined with the mirror's age was probably causing some kind of reflection from outside, maybe sunlight bouncing off a neighbor's window. But even as I rationalized, my pulse quickened. The house felt different with the mirror in place, as if the geometry of the space had shifted slightly. The hallway seemed longer when I looked at it directly, shorter in the reflection. The proportions were subtly wrong in ways that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on the discrepancies. That evening, I tried to ignore the mirror entirely. I made dinner, watched television, read a few chapters of a paperback thriller. But I found myself glancing toward the hallway, catching glimpses of the reflected space that didn't quite match reality. The differences were small: a shadow that fell the wrong way, a doorframe that seemed slightly wider, but they accumulated like splinters under my skin. Around midnight, I decided to test what Mom had written about the sequence. I stood in front of the mirror with the note in my hand, studying the reflected hallway that showed lights in rooms I knew were dark. Living room on. I walked over and flicked the switch. The lamp came on in reality, but in the mirror, it went dark. Kitchen off. The kitchen light was already off, but in the mirror, fluorescent light spilled from the doorway. I left it as it was. Bedroom on. I climbed the stairs and turned on the bedroom light. When I returned to the mirror, the reflected upstairs area was black. Bathroom off. Already off in reality, but glowing softly in the reflection. Hallway on. I reached for the hallway light switch, my hand hovering over it for a long moment. According to Mom's note, this was when the reflection descends. Whatever that meant. I flipped the switch. The hallway light came on above me, casting my reflection sharp and clear in the mirror. But in the reflected hallway behind my image, the light remained off. The reflected space was darker than it should have been, the shadows deeper. And in those shadows, at the far end of the reflected hallway where it met the living room, stood a figure. It was impossible to make out details, just a dark silhouette, human-shaped, but motionless, watching. The figure stood exactly where someone would stand if they were looking down the hallway toward the mirror, toward me. But when I spun around to look directly down the actual hallway, nothing was there. I turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed and pale. Behind my reflected image, the hallway stretched empty and dark, exactly as it should have been with the light off. But I could feel something wrong about the image, something that made my skin crawl even though I couldn't identify what it was. I flicked the hallway light off and on several times, watching my reflection appear and disappear, but the sequence had been broken. The reflected space now matched reality perfectly, as if nothing had ever been wrong. Over the following days, I found myself obsessively checking the mirror. During the day, it behaved normally, reflecting exactly what stood before it. But in the evenings, the discrepancies would return. Lights that were on would appear off in the reflection, and vice versa. The figure in the shadows became a regular presence, always standing just at the edge of clear vision, always gone when I looked directly. I tried to research the mirror's history, but Mom had never mentioned where it came from. A search through her papers revealed nothing. I called my Aunt Margaret, Mom's sister, but she didn't remember ever seeing the mirror in the house. "Your mother collected a lot of strange things toward the end," Margaret told me over the phone, her voice carefully neutral. She was convinced the house was wrong somehow, always moving furniture around, covering mirrors, switching lights on and off at odd hours. We thought it was the dementia. But I was beginning to wonder if Mom had been trying to tell us something else entirely. The sleepless nights were taking their toll. I'd lie in bed listening to the house settle around me, hearing creaks and whispers that might have been wind through loose siding or might have been something else. During the day, I'd catch myself checking over my shoulder, certain I'd glimpsed movement in my peripheral vision. The sequence became a nightly ritual. I'd wait until after midnight, then carefully follow Mom's instructions, watching as the reflected world stubbornly refused to match reality. Each time I completed the sequence, the figure would appear, growing slightly clearer, slightly more defined. It wore clothes, dark pants, a light-colored shirt. Male, I thought, though it was hard to be certain. Average height, average build. It could have been anyone, or no one at all. 2 weeks after hanging the mirror, I decided to break the sequence deliberately. Instead of turning the hallway light on last, I left it off and turned on the bathroom light instead. The reflected bathroom remained dark, but something new appeared in the reflection. Not the usual figure, but movement in the reflected living room. The lamp beside Mom's chair was on in the reflection, and in its glow, I could see someone sitting in the chair. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was clearer than ever before, a man in his 60s wearing clothes I recognized. My father's clothes. Dad had been dead for 5 years. I ran to the living room, my heart hammering. The chair was empty, of course. No light, no figure. Just the familiar furniture arranged exactly as Mom had left it. But when I returned to the mirror, he was still there, sitting calmly in the reflected chair, looking directly at me. His mouth was moving, as if he were speaking, but I couldn't hear anything. I pressed my ear to the mirror's surface, the cold glass shocking against my skin. For just a moment, I thought I heard something, A whisper, too faint to understand. Then the reflection returned to normal. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in a chair across from the mirror, watching it like a security guard, waiting for something to happen. The reflected hallway remained perfectly ordinary, matching reality in every detail. As dawn light filtered through the windows, I felt foolish and exhausted. Maybe Margaret was right. Maybe I was following in Mom's footsteps, seeing things that weren't there, creating patterns and meaning where none existed. Grief did strange things to people. Isolation did strange things. The combination of both, in a house full of memories and shadows, could easily push someone toward what? Madness? Or toward seeing something that had always been there, waiting? That afternoon I called a glass company to ask about removing the mirror. The technician who answered sounded bored and professional, until I described the mirror's size and apparent age. Victorian bronze frame, heavy glass. Listen, if that's authentic, you're looking at some serious money. Antique mirrors like that can be worth thousands, especially if they've got any provenance. After hanging up, I stood in front of the mirror again, studying my reflection. My face looked thinner than I remembered, older. The isolation was definitely getting to me. But as I stared, I noticed something else. My reflected eyes looked different. Not the color or shape, but the expression. While I felt tired and confused, my reflection looked knowing, like it understood something I didn't. I blinked hard and looked again, just tired eyes and a tired face, nothing more. That night, I performed the sequence one last time. I told myself it would be the last time, that tomorrow I'd have the mirror removed and get on with the business of living. But as I turned on the hallway light and saw the figure appear once more in the reflected shadows, I realized that removing the mirror wouldn't solve anything. Because for the first time I was certain I recognized the figure. It was me, or rather, a version of me. Wearing clothes I owned but hadn't put on today. Standing in a hallway that was my hallway, but wasn't quite right. The figure raised its hand in a small wave, and despite myself, I found my own hand rising to wave back. In the glass between us, my reflection waved too, but not at me, at the figure in the reflected hallway. 3 versions of myself, all slightly different, all acknowledging each other across impossible distances. I stepped away from the mirror and walked to the living room, where I sat in Dad's chair and tried to make sense of what I'd seen. The house was quiet around me, but not empty. I could feel the weight of all the lives that had been lived here, all the moments that had accumulated in the walls and floors and ceilings. Mom's note said to look only last, but I was beginning to understand that I'd been looking all along. The mirror hadn't shown me something new. It had shown me something that was already there. Something I'd been seeing out of the corner of my eye for months, without realizing it. The question wasn't whether what I was seeing was real. The question was whether reality was as simple as I'd always believed. I'm still living in the house. The mirror is still hanging in the hallway. Most nights, I follow Mom's sequence, and most nights, the reflection dissents. I've stopped questioning whether it's real or imagined. Instead, I've started wondering if maybe there's no difference between the two. After all, in a house full of memories, who's to say which version of the past or the present is the true one? Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself having conversations with the empty rooms again. But now I'm not so sure they're empty, and I'm not so sure I'm alone. Story 2. The first photograph appeared on a Tuesday morning while I stirred sugar into my coffee. The smart screen embedded in my refrigerator door flickered, displaying what I initially mistook for a screensaver, a bird's eye view of my kitchen, captured from an impossible angle near the ceiling. In the image, I stood at the counter, coffee mug halfway to my lips, frozen in digital amber. The timestamp read 7:23 a.m. I glanced at the microwave clock, 7:22 a.m. My hand trembled, sending ripples across the coffee's surface. The photograph vanished, replaced by the usual weather widget and grocery reminders. I convinced myself it had been a glitch. Some malfunction in the appliance's software, perhaps pulling random stock images from the internet. These smart devices were notorious for their quirks. But the explanation felt thin, even as I clung to it. The second photograph materialized 3 days later during dinner. I was eating leftover pasta, scrolling through my phone, when movement on the refrigerator screen drew my attention. Another aerial shot, this time of my dining room table. In the image, I sat hunched over the same bowl of pasta, phone in hand, wearing the exact clothes I had on. The timestamp, 8:47 p.m. The actual time, 8:46 p.m. 1 minute, always 1 minute ahead. I stood slowly, chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The sound echoed in the silence, amplified by my heightened awareness. I approached the refrigerator, studying the screen's reflection of my own face, pale, drawn, eyes wide with growing unease. The photograph had already disappeared, leaving only the standard interface. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Hidden cameras, though I'd searched every inch of my house after the first incident and found nothing. Hacking, though the photos showed angles that no conventional camera could achieve. Hallucinations, though I'd never experienced anything like this before. The third photograph shattered my remaining skepticism. I was brushing my teeth before bed, foam dripping into the bathroom sink, when I heard the refrigerator's notification chime echo from the kitchen. Against every instinct screaming at me to ignore it, I rinsed my mouth and walked barefoot across the cold tiles. The screen displayed another impossible image. My bathroom, captured from directly above, showing me standing at the sink with toothbrush in hand. But in the photograph, I wasn't alone. A shadow stretched across the bathroom floor, a human silhouette cast by no visible source, extending from the doorway where I now stood. The timestamp read 11:34 p.m. The time was 11:33 p.m. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs. The bathroom behind me was empty, illuminated only by the vanity lights. No shadow, no presence, nothing but my own paranoia and the lingering taste of mint toothpaste. Sleep became elusive. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. Creaks and groans that had never seemed ominous before now sounded like footsteps, like breathing, like whispered conversations in rooms I couldn't see. Every 30 minutes I crept to the kitchen to check the refrigerator screen, but it remained normal, cycling through its programmed displays. The fourth photograph appeared during my lunch break the following day. I worked from home, a freelance graphic designer with deadlines that kept me tethered to my computer for hours at a time. I'd microwaved a frozen meal and was eating mechanically while reviewing client feedback when the notification chimed. This time, I almost didn't look. Almost. But the compulsion was stronger than my fear. The image showed my home office from above, capturing me hunched over my desk with a fork suspended halfway to my mouth. But something was wrong with the lighting. In the photograph, the room appeared darker, as if photographed during dusk rather than midday. The shadows fell at unnatural angles, and in the corner of the frame, just barely visible, was something that shouldn't have been there. A figure standing in the doorway, featureless and indistinct, like a person-shaped void. I checked the timestamp, 1:17 p.m. The current time, 1:16 p.m. My appetite vanished. I pushed the meal away and spent the next hour researching everything I could about smart appliances, surveillance systems, and inexplicable phenomena. The internet offered no explanations that didn't sound absurd. Forums discussed similar experiences, but they read like fiction or the ramblings of unstable minds. I wasn't unstable. I was logical, methodical, grounded in reality. Wasn't I? The photographs began appearing more frequently. Every day brought new images, each one minute ahead of real time, each one revealing details that gnawed at my sanity. I saw myself cooking dinner, while shadows moved independently of any light source. I saw myself watching television while something tall and thin stood behind my couch, just out of focus. I saw myself working, while shapes shifted in the periphery of the frame. Never quite clear enough to identify, but always wrong, always impossible. I stopped eating meals in the kitchen. I unplugged the refrigerator, but the screen continued to function, powered by some internal battery I couldn't locate. I covered the screen with black tape, but somehow the photographs continued to appear, superimposed over the darkness like double exposures. I called the manufacturer, but the customer service representative insisted that the model I described didn't exist, that their smart refrigerators didn't have the capability to take photographs. The shadows in the images grew bolder, more defined. What had started as barely perceptible movements became distinct silhouettes that lurked in doorways, stood behind furniture, or pressed against windows from the outside. They never appeared in my direct vision, only in these prophetic glimpses of moments I hadn't yet lived. I began leaving the house during the times the photographs predicted, thinking I could break the cycle. But when I returned, the refrigerator showed me new images, photographs of my empty house, where the shadows wandered freely through rooms I'd abandoned. They opened cabinets, sat on my furniture, and stood vigil in corners, waiting for my return. Sleep became impossible. Not just because of fear, but because of a growing certainty that sleep itself was dangerous. The shadows in the photographs moved most boldly when I was unconscious, unaware, vulnerable. I survived on caffeine and anxiety, propping my eyelids open with sheer willpower. But exhaustion was a tide I couldn't hold back forever. 3 weeks after the first photograph, I found myself standing in the kitchen at 3:17 a.m., swaying with fatigue, staring at the refrigerator screen. The latest image showed my bedroom from above, the bed empty but rumpled, blankets twisted as if I'd been tossing restlessly. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the photograph's strange lighting, stood a figure more solid than the others. Humanoid but wrong, too tall and thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. The timestamp read, 3:18 a.m. I had 1 minute to decide whether to sleep or to continue my vigil. 1 minute to choose between the exhaustion that was slowly killing me and the unknown fate that awaited in unconsciousness. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, each step echoing in the silence. The room looked exactly as it had in the photograph. Bed unmade, curtains drawn, everything normal except for the creeping sense that I was being watched from every shadow. I sat on the edge of the mattress, hands trembling with caffeine withdrawal and sleep deprivation. The clock on my nightstand read 3:18 a.m. I lay down, pulling the blankets up to my chin, and closed my eyes. For a moment, there was only darkness and the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard it. A soft notification chime from the kitchen below, the refrigerator announcing another photograph. But this time, I didn't go to look. This time, I forced myself to remain still, eyes closed, breathing steady, pretending to sleep while every nerve in my body screamed warnings. I felt the weight of observation pressing down on me like a physical presence, felt the air in the room shift and thicken with something that shouldn't exist. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming up the stairs. I kept my eyes closed, maintained the rhythm of sleep breathing, even as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs and paused outside my door. The doorknob turned with a soft click. Hinges creaked as the door swung open. Something entered my room. I felt it watching me, studying me, confirming what the photograph had already revealed. I was asleep. I was vulnerable. I was exactly where and when the image had predicted I would be. The presence moved closer to the bed, and I realized with crystalline clarity that this moment, this exact moment, was what the photographs had been building toward. All those images of shadows and impossible figures had been leading to this. The moment when I would be photographed sleeping, the moment when I would cross the threshold from observer to subject, from the watcher to the watched. The refrigerator chimed again from the kitchen below, and I knew without looking that it was displaying a new photograph. An image of me lying in bed, eyes closed, blankets pulled up to my chin, looking perfectly peaceful. And somewhere in the frame, captured with digital precision, would be the thing that now stood beside my bed, finally clear enough to see, finally close enough to understand. But I kept my eyes closed, clinging to the illusion of sleep, because I knew with absolute certainty that the moment I opened them, the moment I saw what was taking the photographs, what had been watching me all along. I would never wake up to the reality I'd known before. The notification chime sounded again, and again, and again, each chime marking another photograph, another moment captured, another second of this endless now, where I lay frozen between sleeping and waking, between the world I'd known and whatever waited on the other side of sight. The presence beside my bed remained perfectly still, patient as a portrait, waiting for me to make the choice that would determine which reality I would wake up to, if I woke up at all. The chimes continued, rhythmic as a heartbeat, marking time in a house where time no longer moved in straight lines but in circles, in loops, in photographs that showed futures that became present, that became past, that became photographs again. And I lay there in the center of it all, eyes closed, breathing steady, pretending to sleep while the refrigerator downstairs documented every moment of my surrender to whatever strange mathematics governed this new world I'd discovered, or that had discovered me. The last thing I remembered before the exhaustion finally claimed me was the soft sound of the camera shutter, not from the refrigerator, but from somewhere much closer, somewhere right beside my ear. Click. Story 3. The painting was heavier than I'd expected. My shoulders ached as I held it against the living room wall, searching for the perfect spot where the afternoon light would catch the brushstrokes just right. The antique landscape, a wedding gift from my late aunt, depicted rolling hills beneath storm clouds, the kind of scene that looked peaceful from a distance but harbored something unsettling in its shadows. I'd been living in the apartment for 3 months, and this was my first real attempt at making it feel like home. The previous tenant had left marks on the walls where pictures once hung, ghost rectangles of cleaner paint that reminded me daily of someone else's life. Now, finally, I was claiming the space as my own. The hammer's echo bounced off the bare walls as I drove the nail deep into the plaster. Dust motes danced in the slanted sunlight, and for a moment, everything felt perfectly normal. I stepped back to admire my work, adjusting the frame until it hung level. That night I learned about the sound. I'd always been a light sleeper, prone to waking at the slightest disturbance. But this was different. My eyes snapped open in the darkness, and without checking the clock, I knew it was 3:17 a.m. The knowledge sat in my mind like a foreign object, certain and inexplicable. From the living room wall came a low thrumming, barely audible but unmistakably there. At first I dismissed it as pipes settling or the building's ancient heating system groaning to life. But as I lay there listening, the sound took on a rhythm that made my stomach tighten with recognition. Thump, 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 thump. It was a heartbeat. I slipped out of bed and padded barefoot across the cold hardwood floor. The sound grew clearer as I approached the wall where I'd hung the painting. I pressed my ear against the cool plaster, just below the frame's lower edge. The rhythm was unmistakable now, but something was wrong. The beats came too fast, arriving a split second before my own pulse would naturally follow. It was as if my heart was trying to catch up to an echo of itself, always falling behind by 2 beats. The sensation was profoundly unsettling, like being out of step with my own body. I pulled away from the wall, my hand instinctively moving to my throat to feel my actual pulse. Normal rhythm, normal rate. But when I pressed my ear back to the wall, there it was again. My heartbeat, but not my heartbeat, preceding me by those crucial 2 beats. Sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. The next evening, I positioned myself in the living room at 3:15 a.m., determined to understand what was happening. I sat in my armchair with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, watching the wall as if it might offer some visual explanation for the phenomenon. At precisely 3:17, the sound began. This time, I approached it methodically. I moved the painting aside and placed my palm flat against the wall. The vibration was faint, but real, pulsing through the plaster in that same 2-beat advance of my own rhythm. I tried holding my breath, thinking perhaps my circulation was somehow affecting what I heard. but the wall's pulse continued unchanged. I pulled out my phone and recorded the sound, but when I played it back, there was nothing, just the ambient hum of the building and my own breathing. The recording revealed no trace of the rhythmic thrumming that had been so clear to my ears. That's when the real fear crept in. Over the next week, I developed a ritual. Each night at 3:15, I would position myself by the wall, waiting for the sound that only I could hear. I began to notice subtle changes in the rhythm, minor variations that seemed to correspond to my emotional state. When I was anxious, the beats came slightly faster. When I was tired, they dragged, growing deeper and more pronounced. The most disturbing realization came on Thursday night when I measured the gap between the wall's pulse and my own. 2 beats ahead, always 2 beats ahead. But as I sat there focusing intently on both rhythms, I could feel my heart beginning to speed up, trying to close that gap. I jerked away from the wall as if it had burned me. The next morning, I rearranged the living room furniture. I told myself it was spring cleaning, but I knew the real reason. I needed to disrupt whatever connection existed between that wall and my body's rhythm. I moved the couch to block direct access to the spot where the sound was strongest. I repositioned the coffee table and relocated 2 large bookshelves to create a barrier of mass and material between me and the wall. That night, the sound was muffled but still present. Worse, it seemed to be adapting, finding new pathways through the room to reach me. I could feel it resonating through the floorboards, traveling up through the legs of my chair and into my body through my bones. Desperate, I turned to sound itself as a weapon. I gathered every radio I could find, an old AM/FM unit from the kitchen, a battery-powered emergency radio, and a vintage transistor radio I'd inherited from my grandfather. I tuned each one between stations, filling the apartment with layers of static and white noise. The harsh, chaotic sound made my teeth ache, but it was better than the alternative. The cacophony masked the wall's pulse, but only partially. Underneath the electronic static, I could still sense that rhythmic thrumming, like a bass line played too low to consciously hear, but loud enough to feel in my chest cavity. I began sleeping on the couch as far from the wall as possible, surrounded by the hissing chorus of detuned radios. But even there, in the early hours before dawn, I could feel my pulse trying to sync with something it couldn't quite reach. My heart would stutter, skip a beat, then resume its normal rhythm with a flutter that left me breathless and sweating. By the second week, I was researching the building's history online, combing through property records and newspaper archives for any mention of unusual incidents. I found nothing, just decades of ordinary tenants living ordinary lives in the same space where I now felt myself slowly coming apart. I started timing everything. The sound began at exactly 3:17 a.m. and lasted for approximately 43 minutes before fading to nothing. During those 43 minutes, I could feel my cardiovascular system fighting against an invisible influence, my pulse becoming erratic as it tried to match a rhythm that shouldn't exist. The furniture barrier wasn't enough. I added layers of heavy blankets hung from nails, creating a makeshift sound dampening system that made the living room feel like a padded cell. I increased the number of radios to 5, then 7, filling every available outlet with devices broadcasting static at maximum volume. The neighbors began to complain. Mrs. Chen from upstairs knocked on my door on a Tuesday afternoon, her face creased with concern. She asked if everything was all right, mentioning the constant noise coming from my apartment during the night. I assured her it was temporary, that I was working on a sound project for work. The lie came easily, but I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe me. That night, I made a terrible discovery. Despite all my precautions, the furniture, the blankets, the wall of static, when 3:17 arrived, I could feel my heart beginning to align with the wall's rhythm. Not just the 2-beat lag closing, but an actual synchronization starting to occur. For perhaps 10 seconds, our pulses matched perfectly, and in that moment, I experienced something I can only describe as displacement. I was simultaneously sitting on my couch and embedded in the wall itself. I could feel the building's structure around me like a second skeleton, its weight pressing against my consciousness from all directions. The sensation was claustrophobic and expansive at once, as if I was being absorbed into something vast and architectural. When my heart finally stuttered back to its own rhythm, I gasped and found myself alone on the couch, drenched in sweat and shaking. The next day, I called in sick to work and spent hours researching cardiac arrhythmias, sleep disorders, and auditory hallucinations. I scheduled an appointment with my doctor, then canceled it, then rescheduled it again. How could I explain that my apartment wall was trying to steal my heartbeat? I measured the distance between my couch and the wall. 14 feet. I moved the couch back another 3 feet, then 5 more. By Friday, I was sleeping pressed against the opposite wall, but the sensation of synchronization continued to grow stronger. Saturday night brought a new revelation that shattered what remained of my rational worldview. At 3:17 a.m., as I sat rigidly upright against the far wall with 7 radios screaming static around me, I felt the synchronization begin earlier than usual. But this time, instead of my heart speeding up to match the wall's rhythm, I felt the wall's pulse slowing down to meet mine. The realization hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't trying to impose its rhythm on me anymore. We were meeting somewhere in the middle, finding a shared cadence that belonged to neither of us individually. And in that moment of perfect synchronization, I understood with terrible clarity that the wall wasn't just echoing my heartbeat. It was making space for me, creating a hollow in its structure exactly the size and shape of a human body, waiting for me to step inside and become part of the building itself. I jerked my body back into its own rhythm, but the knowledge remained. Every night, the synchronization was lasting a little longer. The space in the wall was becoming more defined, more real. Soon, the choice would no longer be mine to make. Now I sit here at 3 a.m., watching the clock tick toward the inevitable moment. The radios have fallen silent. Their electronic screaming seems pointless now. The furniture I've piled against the wall looks fragile and inadequate, like a child's fort built to keep out monsters that are already inside. I can feel my pulse beginning to change, anticipating the call that will come in 17 minutes. My chest feels hollow, as if my heart is already preparing to relocate, to find its new home in the wall where someone else's echo has been waiting all along. The painting hangs crooked now. I knocked it askew during one of my midnight furniture rearrangements, and I haven't straightened it. In the dim light from the street, the storm clouds in the landscape seem to be moving, gathering above those peaceful hills where shadows hide things that were never meant to be found. 16 minutes now. I can hear my pulse in my ears, and underneath it, something else. A hollow tapping from inside the wall, patient as a grave and twice as deep. I've been thinking about the previous tenant, about why they left those ghost rectangles on the walls, about whether they hung heavy paintings that require deep nails driven into plaster that might disturb whatever sleeps behind the surface, about whether they heard the sound at 3:17 a.m., felt the synchronization beginning, and fled before the wall could finish making space for them. 15 minutes. My heart is already starting to race. Story 4. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as I pulled into the gravel lot of Station 47, my headlights cutting through the October darkness like tired knives. Another overnight shift at this godforsaken outpost. Another 12 hours of monitoring equipment that rarely needed monitoring in a building that shouldn't exist this far from civilization. The digital clock on my dashboard read 11:30 p.m. as I killed the engine, but something felt wrong about that simple number glowing green in the darkness. 20 minutes early, just like always. Habit kept me punctual, even when punctuality meant nothing out here in the middle of nowhere, where the nearest town lay 40 miles south, and the nearest neighbor was probably a family of deer. I grabbed my toolbox and thermos, the metal handle cold enough to bite through my work gloves, and trudged toward the single-story concrete building that housed more computing power than most small cities. The night air carried that particular stillness that comes before snow, thick and expectant, pressing against my eardrums like cotton. My boots crunched on frost-brittle leaves as I approached the entrance, where motion sensors should have triggered the exterior floods. Instead, Darkness wrapped around the building like a shroud, broken only by the pale glow seeping through reinforced windows. Inside, the warmth hit me immediately, along with something else, a heaviness that seemed to settle between my shoulder blades. The building felt too quiet, even for a place designed to run itself. No hum of ventilation systems, no whisper of hard drives spinning, just the steady pulse of LED indicators painting the walls in blues and greens and reds. I checked my phone out of habit. No signal, which was normal out here, but the time display made me pause. 11:42 p.m. Had I really spent 12 minutes walking from the parking lot? The distance couldn't have been more than 50 yards, and I hadn't dawdled. The control room stretched before me, banks of monitors displaying readouts from sensors scattered across 3 counties. Weather data, seismic measurements, atmospheric pressure, all the invisible forces that shape the world reduced to numbers scrolling endlessly down dark screens. I settled into the worn chair at the central console and began my routine checks, muscle memory guiding my fingers across familiar controls. That's when I noticed the clocks. Every timepiece in the room, the digital display on the main computer, the LED readout on the backup system, the old analog wall clock my predecessor had installed, all showed 23:42. All of them. The seconds weren't even ticking forward on the digital displays. They simply held that single moment like a photograph. I tapped the main computer screen, thinking maybe it had frozen, but the cursor moved responsively across the display. Everything else functioned normally. Data flowed in real time from the remote sensors. Weather patterns updated every few minutes, but time itself had apparently stopped at 18 minutes before midnight. My first thought was power surge. Sometimes electrical anomalies could scramble clocks and timers, though I'd never seen it affect every timepiece simultaneously. I pulled up the system logs, scanning for any indication of power loss or equipment failure, but found nothing unusual. Voltage levels held steady, backup systems showed green across the board, and the building's main power grid registered no fluctuations for the past week. Still, protocols were protocols. I initiated a controlled restart of all timing systems, watching as screens flickered and displays went dark before slowly coming back online. One by one, the clocks reappeared on their respective screens, each one showing the same impossible time. 23:42. The wall clock's second hand had resumed its steady sweep, but instead of advancing toward 23:43, it completed its circuit and started again, tracing the same 60-second journey like a hamster on a wheel. I stood close enough to hear its mechanism, the tiny click of gears and springs working exactly as they should, except they weren't working toward anything. I tried adjusting the system time manually, but the computer rejected every input. Error messages flashed briefly. Temporal synchronization locked. External reference required. Time source unavailable. Technical gibberish that told me nothing except that something had gone fundamentally wrong with the way this place perceived reality. The rational part of my mind suggested calling for backup, but my phone showed the same frozen time as everything else. Even its internal clock had somehow been infected by whatever was wrong with this place. I could drive to the nearest town and report the malfunction, but that would mean abandoning my post, and 20 years of steady employment had trained me never to abandon my post. Besides, what would I tell them? That time had stopped? That every clock in a government monitoring station had decided to take a coffee break at the same arbitrary moment? They'd assume I'd been drinking or worse, and I'd probably lose my security clearance before the investigation even began. I decided to inspect the backup power systems. Sometimes timing circuits drew from auxiliary sources during maintenance mode, and maybe something had gone wrong during the last scheduled update. The utility room lay down a short corridor lined with more monitors, each one dutifully displaying its own version of 23:42. As I passed the first bank of screens, something moved in my peripheral vision. I turned quickly, but saw only my own reflection staring back from the dark surface of a dormant monitor. The fluorescent lights overhead painted harsh shadows under my eyes, making my face look haggard and unfamiliar. I'd been working too many double shifts lately, pulling overtime to pay for the new roof my house desperately needed. Maybe fatigue was finally catching up with me. But as I started to turn away, the reflection seemed to lag for just a moment, as if the mirror version of myself was slightly out of sync with the original. I stopped and waved my hand experimentally. My reflection waved back immediately, perfectly synchronized, and I felt ridiculous for even checking. The utility room's heavy door opened with a pneumatic hiss, revealing racks of equipment humming quietly in climate-controlled darkness. Battery backup systems, voltage regulators, and the master timing circuit that synchronized all building operations. Everything looked exactly as it should, green LEDs indicating normal operation across the board. I ran a diagnostic on the timing circuit anyway, watching as the system tested each component in sequence. All checks passed. According to every instrument in the room, time was flowing normally throughout the building. The atomic clock receiver was locked onto the national time standard, the GPS synchronization was functioning perfectly, and the internal crystal oscillators were maintaining their specified frequencies. Yet every clock still showed 23/42. I stood there for perhaps 10 minutes, trying to reconcile the contradiction between what the instruments told me and what my eyes could clearly see. The diagnostic logs showed continuous operation dating back months, with no gaps or errors that might explain the current anomaly. It was as if the building existed in two different realities, one where time flowed normally, and one where it had stopped 18 minutes before midnight. When I returned to the control room, something had changed. The monitors still showed their endless streams of sensor data, but now there was something else visible in their reflective surfaces. Shapes that didn't correspond to anything in the room behind me. Dark silhouettes that seemed to stand just beyond the edge of visibility, like shadows cast by objects that weren't there. I told myself it was pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in clouds and figures in random patterns. Working alone in an isolated building at night could play tricks on anyone's perception, especially when fatigue and stress were already clouding my judgment. But as I moved between workstations, the shapes seemed to follow, always remaining just out of direct sight but unmistakably present in the glossy screens. They had no faces. That detail emerged gradually as my eyes adjusted to the subtle interplay of light and reflection. Where faces should have been, there was only smooth darkness, as if someone had erased their features with careful precision. They stood perfectly still, patient as statues, watching from inside the monitors with their impossible eyes. I tried to concentrate on my work, updating logs and reviewing sensor readings, but the figures never disappeared entirely. Sometimes they seemed closer, crowding near the edges of screens like curious children pressing against aquarium glass. Other times they retreated into the electronic depths, barely visible shadows that might have been nothing more than artifacts of the display technology. The building's heating system cycled on with a distant rumble, and I realized how cold the control room had become. My breath formed brief clouds in the stale air, and my fingers were growing stiff despite my work gloves. I checked the thermostat, but it showed a comfortable 72 degrees. Either the sensor was malfunctioning, or my body was responding to something the instruments couldn't measure. I decided to take a break, maybe step outside for some fresh air and perspective. The main entrance lay just 30 feet away, past the reception area with its empty chairs and outdated safety posters. I could see the exit clearly through the reinforced glass doors, the parking lot beyond lit by pale starlight. But as I approached the doors, they remained firmly closed. I pressed the release button beside the frame, and nothing happened. The mechanism didn't even click. I tried the manual override, but the heavy doors felt like they were sealed shut, as if someone had welded them into their frames while I wasn't looking. Through the glass, I could see my truck waiting in the parking lot, so close I could almost touch it, but I might as well have been looking at the moon. The fire exit at the rear of the building was similarly unresponsive. Emergency exits weren't supposed to lock from the inside. It violated a dozen safety codes, but the doors refused to budge no matter how hard I pushed. Even the windows, despite being designed never to open, seemed somehow more solid than they should have been, as if the glass had thickened while I wasn't watching. A low tone echoed through the building, the same sound that usually indicated the end of a system test or the completion of a data upload. But I hadn't initiated any tests, and no uploads were scheduled for the overnight shift. The tone repeated every few seconds, rhythmic and mechanical, like a heartbeat made of electricity. I returned to the control room to find that the figures in the monitors had moved closer. They pressed against the inner surfaces of the screens now, their featureless faces nearly touching the glass from the other side. I could see details that shouldn't have been possible in mere reflections. The texture of fabric, the subtle movement of breathing, the way their heads turned to track my movements across the room. One of them raised what might have been a hand and placed it flat against the screen, fingers splayed like a starfish. The glass began to ripple where the hand touched it. Not like water,